Okay, this next section of the show, it's long overdue. When did I tell you about this next section?
Like within the first 3 months of this channel, I'd say. Like well over a year ago.
I've had this idea that I've wanted to do for a long time, and I decided,
we did
know what?
We watched the whole thing. We sat down. We scripted something.
We recorded.
We recorded something.
We never released.
Didn't really feel right.
It didn't feel
Do
right.
we still have it? Is that still available somewhere?
I don't think so. It's back on an old computer, I think. But you know what?
Old news.
It's probably gone. We're going to end up re-recording it. We're going to be doing more of these sections. And really, we're going to be trying out some new stuff as we go into the new year. So we want to hear from the community what you think. But this next section of the show, it's about that feeling that you get when you're watching TV, or you're watching a YouTube channel, something that is not comic book centric. And then you have that moment and you go, whoa, that's a comic.
You know, it's like that feeling when you're a little kid, right? And you go and you're after school and you're walking home, you're walking to your best friend's house. You get to your best friend's house, you're hanging out, you're playing video games, you're reading comic books. Best friend's mom comes in, you're like, guys want a pizza? Yeah! That's what this is like. It's like, yeah, you had one cool thing, and then boom, comes in, it becomes even cooler.
That's right. When comic books are introduced to stuff, I get excited. I'm like, heck yeah. And I look around at the people with me, and they don't care.
They don't care. They never care.
But you know who cares?
We care.
We care. And you know who else cares? I think.
I hope you care.
We hope that you care.
We're going to make you care.
All right, we're talking about comic books that broke through. We're talking about comic books in mainstream. And let's start off with one that I know a lot of people noticed this past year. We're talking about Stranger Things season number 3.
It's an easy one.
That's right. We have a character.
Yes. Her name is Max.
Max is holding up 2 comic books on screen for the world to see. And I got excited because both of these came out in 1985.
Nice touch. I mean, it's obviously this is what they should do. The show is set in 1985. So their comics, they should, if they're holding 2 comics up, they should be 1985 or earlier and not later like in some other shows.
That's right. And right now we have 2 comics to talk about. We have Green Lantern issue number 185 coming out in February that year. So that's some good continuity right there.
So that's probably like a book a couple months old from her collection.
But here's what's super, super funny. We have Wonder Woman issue number 326 that's in her other hand. This comic book actually came out in July 1985. And I looked up, Stranger Things season 3 actually takes place in summertime, in July. So that doesn't just mean that Max went and found a comic book that came out earlier that year. This means that either Max had a freaking pull list or went to a store that very month and got this comic book.
That's a fresh issue right there.
Fresh issue. Good job, Max, being up on your titles. Now, everyone saw those comics, but there have actually been other references in Stranger Things specifically to the comic book community.
In the very first episode of Stranger Things, there was a pretty cool reference to an extremely popular, important comic book.
That's right. And it kind of foreshadowed what was to come with the lead character,
Correct.
One of the leads.
So
but
it works on multiple levels. It's a cool key comic book. This kid knows his key comics, by the way, so that's important. You got to be up on your key comics. If only there was some sort of app you could download to keep you up and up to date and informed on key comic books.
I think he may have been a key collector
That
downloader.
might have been Nick.
Maybe Nick. Oh my goodness. Did we just find a real first appearance of Nick? Was Nick actually in Stranger Things? Because this kid, I forget who it even was.
It was Will. It was Will and Dustin riding home on their bikes.
That's right. Will and Dustin. And they made a bet.
Whoever gets home first, you can have one of my comics.
I'll take your X-Men 134.
That's right. And the issue it referenced is I'll take your X-Men 134. Classic Chris Claremont. The beginning of the Dark Phoenix saga.
Which, if you've seen Stranger Things, you can kind of draw some very clear parallels between Phoenix and the character of 11.
That's correct. Okay, so let's move on from Stranger Things because comic books, they obviously Stranger Things is an awesome 80s show, but it's a kind of an easy one to dive into. I want to talk about kind of a comic appearance in something a little bit lesser known. A horror movie that came out in 2010 called Altitude.
Sounds awesome already.
It's a horror movie about kids on a plane. And there's like creatures in the sky, tentacle monsters. I'm talking like H.P. Lovecraft kind of stuff. And I'm not going to give anything away. I don't want to get into it. But what I want to talk about is a scene that stopped me in my tracks. I remember when I first saw this years ago, I posted it on Instagram.
I remember you showed me this scene last year when we were talking about this idea for comic books in other forms of media. You pulled this very clip up and showed it to me, and it was comical.
We have a bully that finds a comic book in the protagonist's backpack. He takes it out, and it is a rendition of an anthology horror comic book. They call it,
Weird stories.
yeah, it's instead of like Weird Tales or Tales from the Crypt, but the idea is the same. It looks like a horror comic book, and this bully makes fun of the person who owns it. He's like, oh, I'm going to take it, and I'm going to take it out of this plastic bag that it's in, and he makes fun of the plastic and the cardboard.
Careful, it's a comic book.
I'll just give it back.
Oh my god, I'm taking it out of its protective case thing.
And then he goes on to do something just terrible.
Doesn't he rip it?
He starts crumbling the comic book.
Oh, hell no.
What are you, 7 years old reading comics?
That's right. And you know what's I find interesting is that it's like, to the even average viewer, the fact that it looks like an anthology comic book is probably like, comes and goes. Like, who cares about that? But this idea that there's a value to comic books, even if there was no value indicated, the fact that they mentioned there's plastic on it, oh, we got to keep it safe, and then he starts crumbling it in front of the owner. I think that speaks to something that just in culture we've adapted. There's this value to comic books across the board that's recognized.
Yeah, it's pretty easy to tell if this dork is dorky enough to carry a comic book with him and keep it in plastic.
That's
He
right.
must be a big loser dork who's concerned about keeping his dorky comics intact.
But it gets even better because who was the director of this movie?
It's Carr Andrews.
That's right. This guy's a freaking comic book artist.
Yes, I own several variant covers that he's done. I didn't even know he'd made a horror movie on a plane before.
That's right. And this artist, well known, put this movie together and it went straight to digital. At home release. A lot of people didn't watch it.
I never heard of it.
That's right. It's cool stuff though.
But tentacles, airplanes, I'm on.
And a comic book creator who directed the movie. And I like to think that some of these scenes came from a comic book collector.
Speaking of airplanes, Tom, and comic books being involved in certain things, there was one television show that had that had a comic book in it that had an airplane in it also. Tom. Lost.
We're talking about Lost
Talking
again?
about Lost, because there's definitely a comic book
Dude,
in that show.
How is it that we keep talking about Lost on this show?
I don't know.
This show ended such a long time ago. What is happening? Okay, so we're talking about comic books as they enter into mainstream life. And
Lost
this
is the most
show-
mainstream show of all.
Dude, that show was popping when it came out. And man, I just, like, it was shaking my reality when I was watching it.
At least back in that first season when most people were on board and it had yet to really get too weird and too, time travel-y and
There's a point you realize they're just not going to answer anything.
yes, and that's when the vast majority of people checked out. But in the early era of Lost, there was a young boy named Walt who was reading a comic book on the beach.
Canado sepe que me.
It was a comic book called Green Lantern Flash Fast Friends.
Whoa, that's a comic.
Exactly. Hence the name of this segment.
That's right. And we have Green Lantern and the Flash, Faster Friends Part 1, but it gets even better because this is a comic that's actually showcased in the book quite heavily in this episode. There's a polar bear panel in there that's referenced.
You know what's even more interesting? To tie this all together even more, it was a foreign comic.
That's right. In the show, this comic is not an American comic. This is a Spanish version. It's part of the plot. But holy smokes, we're talking about foreign comics right now.
Boom.
Full circle.
Lost is always relevant.